You're on a path in the woods. At the end of that path is a cabin. In the basement of that cabin is a princess, and you're here to slay her. These are the opening lines to the 2023 horror game Slay the Princess. Produced by Black Tabby Games and released on Steam to rave reviews, it quickly garnered a reputation as the best horror game of that year, absolutely sweeping the competition prior with its unique atmosphere, incredible art style, and Lovecraftian premise. There are multiple endings in Slay the Princess, and this video contains general spoilers for basically the entire thing. If you aren't okay with that, I would suggest playing Slay the Princess yourself before watching this video. This is the only warning I'll be giving regarding spoilers. I'll also be issuing a trigger warning for several reasons. If you're familiar with Slay the Princess, you're aware of the presence of gore, body horror, eldritch horror, and adjacent things. This video specifically will also include discussions related to mental health, including but not limited to trauma, depression, suicide, and obviously plurality. Once again, this is the only warning I'll be giving, as these subjects are important to the entirety of the video. With that out of the way, this video is going to be split into parts or chapters. You are approaching the end of the prologue. Part 1 of this video will break down the basic premise of Slay the Princess. Part 2 will add real-world background for my interpretation of the game, and Part 3 will reassess the game through the lens of plurality as established in the second chapter. So this marks the end of the prologue. You can use the chapter markers provided in the progress bar to jump to whichever part you would like. I hope you enjoy the video. There are 3 characters in Slay the Princess, those being the player or hero, the princess, and the narrator. The narrator specifically stands out as he's unique compared to the others, but we'll get to that in a moment. The narrator guides the hero through the woods and into the cabin where the princess is being kept. He instructs the hero on his task: slay the princess and save the world. Even in these beginning moments, the charm of the game is laid on thick. A tense atmosphere where, if you so choose, you can badger the narrator who is unmoving in his convictions. Potentially unbeknownst to the player, however, is that these dialogue choices are far less trivial than they seem. In fact, this is a game of choices, of cause and effect, and of perception. For example, in the cabin there is a pristine blade. If the player chooses to take this blade with them to slay the princess, she'll be aggressive upon noticing their presence. But if you leave the blade, which is entirely possible much to the annoyance of the narrator, you'll find that the princess is far more cooperative than she is when you're with a weapon. This is where the game's hook starts to sink in. Every choice you make in this game affects how the hero will interact with the princess. And that may seem like something obvious to include in a text-based title like this, but it isn't until the time loop closes for the first time that the player will truly realize what they've gotten themselves into. Because no matter what happens, whether the hero slays the princess or not, the outcome is the same. Eventually, everything goes black, and you die. You wake up on a path in the woods. At the end of that path is a cabin. In the basement of that cabin is a princess, and you're here to slay her. So obviously the hero is distressed by this new information, the realization that not only is he alive, but that the narrator doesn't remember a moment of what he's just experienced, a death most likely at the hand of the princess. And there's something else strange too. There are 2 heroes now, 3 voices arguing in the woods, but 1 body. The hero, the narrator, and the voice of the hero who passed. Let's make up an example so we can get a grasp of the subject of plurality as a mental health related term. We'll make up a person. This person isn't real, so any resemblance they have to a real person, that's all coincidence. They exist specifically for me to explain plurality as a phenomenon. So one day, this person we've just made up is taking a walk. It's been a particularly bad year for this person, and not only that, but they've uncovered a lot of childhood trauma as well. For those months, let's just say they've been through a rough patch with their friends, very trusted friends that they no longer associate with. This happened to result in the aforementioned uncovered childhood trauma while this person was isolating themselves and slipping into a depression. Now, this person is a student. Let's say they're in college, living alone. They don't really have a solid foundation to stand on, and not only this, but all their remaining friends are busy as finals are approaching. Now here's where things start to get tricky, because our friend here is becoming emotionally volatile. They're suicidal, and essentially this is rock bottom. So they go to their doctor and they talk about how awful the past few months have been. The doctor refers this person to a psychiatrist. As a result, this example person has been diagnosed with complex PTSD. Remember this, it's going to be important. Now with all this background established, let's continue. Our example person is on a walk. They've been reflecting on the difficulties they've been facing in the past few months. Specifically, they're curious about their more emotional outbursts. Because during these outbursts, when this person is at their most volatile and vulnerable, they lose control. As in, it's as if they aren't the only one piloting their own body. And as they're walking along and thinking about how distressing and strange this sensation is, this dissociative fugue, they hear something. Well, it's not hearing in the literal sense, more that they perceive something that can't be heard. There's another voice in their head. Our example person is plural, or a system. Now what does that mean? It sounds like a stereotype from a horror movie, and yes, plurality can manifest as the commonly misunderstood and demonized condition known as dissociative identity disorder. But this is not the only possible way it can appear. It can appear as internal families, psychosis, and other dissociative disorders not mentioned. If I were to list all the possibilities, we'd be here all day. According to pluralityresource.org, plurality is defined by systems as, quote, someone who shares the same physical body with other individuals, end quote. Plurality often arises in a person as a defense response to severe and often prolonged trauma experienced during early developmental stages of childhood. As a result, those who are plural find themselves diagnosed with other trauma-related disorders as well. For dissociative identity disorder specifically, the most common comorbidities as listed by didresearch.org includes but is not limited to post-traumatic stress disorder, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, borderline personality disorder, depression, bipolar disorder, and many obsessive-compulsive disorders. So what's the point of exploring this topic? What does this have to do with Slay the Princess? Well, it's my belief that when viewed through the lens of plurality, Slay the Princess can be given entirely new meaning. This is less of a theory of mine and more, as I said, a lens through which to view the story, because as far as I've seen online, there's no recorded reference of Black Tabby games referring to the subject of plurality as being a source of inspiration for the game. So as far as I know, this parallel is completely unintentional. This makes it even more fascinating to me, however, because, in my personal opinion, Slay the Princess is the most thorough and respectful piece of media to portray plurality that I have ever seen. This isn't exactly a high bar to set, considering that when most people think of dissociative identity disorder or plurality as a whole, they think of horror movies like Split, or fictional serial killers like Genocide Jack of Danganronpa. It's okay to enjoy media with bad representation, of course, but it's also important to understand the potential bias that this can give a viewer. Plural folks are not all serial killers. They are not all dangerous. They are not all monsters. And for the longest time, horror media has been working overtime to convince the world otherwise. But despite also being a horror game, Slay the Princess is different, because the hero has more than one voice. Earlier in this video, I established the narrator as one of a kind compared to the other two characters in this game. I also reassured you that this would be revisited later, and the time for that is now. Unlike the hero, and unlike the princess, there is only ever one narrator. Which sounds weird, right? We know by now that there's more than one hero. In fact, every time the hero dies, another voice joins the party. But I never said anything about the princess. For those who haven't played the game, this is what the spoiler warning was for. For every reset of the timeline in this game, the princess changes drastically. Not only does she change, but the cabin changes as well. It manifests as a dungeon, a cave, or a tower. With this context, we realize that slaying the princess is in fact a very small aspect of this game. The true goal of the game, Slay the Princess, is in fact to collect the perspectives of the different forms of the eldritch goddess she represents, known as the Shifting Mound, a manifestation of death who greets you after you've died a number of times. Upon meeting her, the Shifting Mound will, in a way, collect the form of the princess the player has unlocked. She'll absorb her into her being and send you on your way to collect more until she's whole. And with that knowledge, having played the game and seen all of this, I can't tell you which path is canon, which path is the true ending, or the route intended by the developers, because there isn't one. They are all canon, because no matter how you change her, or the environment, or her prison, the princess is still the princess. The princess is plural. By adapting to a repeating, stressful, traumatizing circumstance where she is chained in a cabin and somebody attempts to murder her, she changes based on how the player treats her. The hero is plural. In a similar way to the princess, he'll adapt to his repeated deaths by gaining more and more voices of his own, all of which disappear when viewing himself in a mirror and seeing himself directly for the first time in the game. Going back to the first time you meet the princess, variation is even present in her personality in this first run of the game. As mentioned before, if you take the knife, she's hostile. If not, she's sweet. But in both outcomes, without the assurance of freedom, she'll still chew her arm off to reach it. They're the same princess. They're all the princess. No one is real or less canon than the other because they're all her parts. They're facets, or headmates. They're just as real as her supposed original that you encounter is, and even that original contains variations. Because being a system is like gemstones, many faces meeting together to make something beautiful under incredible pressure. And what's really reassuring about Slay the Princess is that it isn't the subject of being multiple that is the source of the horror. The princess isn't dangerous because she's plural. She isn't stated to have DID, that wouldn't make any sense. Within the context of the time loop and her being an eldritch god, her existence as the Shifting Mound is not the most horrifying thing about her. What's horrifying is that these were adaptations forced by her environment. What's comforting is that every one of these altars has a place in the Shifting Mound. You bring them to her, and she'll tell you something good about them. That they're brave, or resilient, or wild and free, and she'll take them into herself gladly. This is systemhood. This is the acceptance and love of oneself and one's altars. The understanding that no matter how scary it gets, that you're all on the same team. You're all fighting the same fight. That there's light at the end of the tunnel and escape from the time loop of re-traumatization is possible for anyone, and that at the end of it all, there are no bad parts.